Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. 1 year into Donald Trump's second term, relations between the United States and the European Union are under unprecedented strain, from tariff threats linked to Greenland to talk of a parallel global order and a revived trade confrontation. Trump's presidency has redrawn the rules of transatlantic engagement. As Brussels weighs its response, including use of the so-called trade bazooka, questions grow over law, leverage and limits. Joining us is William Worcester. He's Assistant Professor of International Law at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. Professor Worcester, thank you for taking the time. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So how would you characterize President Trump's first year in terms of trade policy?
Well, one of the interesting developments is this new use of trade policy, tariffs in particular, as a means to extract other types of policy achievements. So whether it be threatening trade because of the whole Greenland business, whether it be threatening tariffs on French wine because of membership in a board of peace or anything like this, it's a use of tariffs rather than just solving trade issues or trade imbalances, but to use those tariffs in this really aggressive way, alongside and buttressing, say, an enhanced willingness to use military force to achieve what are generally understood to be unrelated political ends.
Right. So where is the legal line drawn then between using tariffs for economic purposes to even out trade and using it as a coercive tool to get countries to do what you want them to do?
Well, legally, there are a whole number of trade agreements. This was, for example, the U.S. EU trade deal that's now probably going to be suspended. But you have a number of agreements on reductions of trade. So there you would have an international law where two states would agree to a particular trade tariff rate on a variety of different goods and services. You might have things like membership in a World Trade Organization, which might have limitations on your ability to have other types of limitations on trade, import-export restrictions, et cetera. So there can be a whole wide range of agreements that states have undertaken to try to stabilize and make their trade relationship predictable. What makes this a bit more difficult is when, as I said before, you're bringing in these sort of external issues, these issues that are really unrelated to trade, and you're using trade as a way to extract these other things. Within most of these trade agreements, there are a whole range of exceptions. You might be able to adjust tariffs if one state is, say, dumping goods or engaging in unfair pricing or other types of violations of the underlying trade agreement. But most of these agreements don't contemplate that you would then use tariffs, you would use trade, you would use import restrictions as a way to deal with, say, military conquest of territory or other types of ends. So the line is that they are being used for something that they're not intended to, and they don't really fall within the agreements that states have made, the treaties that states have made that provide for exceptions.
Yes, but are there legal sanctions for using it in this way?
So when states do things that other states don't like, effectively, states can always reply. They always have a legal right to respond to something. And this was the proposal on behalf of the European Union when the U.S. proposed a wide range of tariffs that the European Union would have all these retaliation tariffs. I think it was 93 billion euro or something like that. So states can always do those kinds of responses. There's a slightly different legal situation when states are outright violating international law that governs their trade relations. When that happens, that's a far more serious situation, and we talk about a violation of international law, which would then trigger all the normal dispute settlement mechanisms that international law would have, including the adoption of countermeasures, which could go so far as to include the other state, the victim state, violating international law itself in an effort to induce the other state to comply. So there's the more mild issues, which are normal disputes that fall within the legal discretions of the states. That's a little bit different from when you start violating treaties outright and you have to suffer the consequences for that.
How would those breaches of agreements be enforced?
So states can enforce measures against each other in a variety of different ways. Generally, when we think about enforcement and we see things like sanctions and we see these big moves that are being discussed right now within the European Union and in the United States for punishing another state or for trying to extract some type of concessions, there are far more mild measures. Just for example, imagine that you are an American diplomat walking the halls of the United Nations trying to convince other states to cooperate with you on something that goes completely under the radar, water quality issues, or something that air transport agreements, or something that is rather mundane but could be really important. You're going to have quite a lot less leverage in that discussion with all these other parties. So the enforcement can be something that's integrated into the treaty. It can be something where there is a deliberate mechanism for triggering additional tariffs. It can be something that is potentially outside. For example, what if the European Union just started selling more, United States bonds, which the U.S. is very vulnerable about? What if the European Union started increasing some military activity or training operations in and around Greenland? What if Denmark decided that they were going to start restricting exports of insulin and Ozempic to the United States? There are a whole variety of these other kinds of things that you can do. And then there's the far more mild things, which have to do with the ability of states to convince, rather than coerce, convince other states to change their policies and align with them. And that becomes increasingly difficult when you start violating international law.
Well, and the other aspect to this, of course, as well, Professor, is that within the European Union, the losses of these threats by the United States vary in terms of importance. So, putting tariffs on French champagne has less of an impact on France than putting tariffs on German cars going to the United States, because a much larger proportion of the German economy is based on the automotive industry. Do we need a unified European Union response to react, to respond to these threats by the United States?
Well, there's a couple of levels at which the European Union thinks that the risk is. There's a much lower level where the European Union says that these are unfair, these are unequal, these are potentially violative of agreements, tariff measures or trade sanctions, and can impose various smaller level measures. And those can be very targeted. Just as you were saying, there are different levels of or different types of goods that have different importance. I mean, imagine if the European Union, and they've discussed this, were to target exports from the United States from so-called red states, right? Kentucky bourbon and soybeans, poultry, maybe Boeing aircraft, something like that. There could be very specific targeted sanctions. But it's a slightly different thing when the types of economic measures and tariffs are felt as economic coercion. And what we mean by that is really an infringement of the sovereignty of the other state, a limitation on that state's ability to just exercise its normal political discretion in what its international relations are going to be. That's the issue of the trade bazooka. If indeed it rises from the level of a mere trade dispute into a dispute over sovereignty and sovereign ability to exercise one's own independent judgment on the world stage, that then triggers a whole host of different measures that can be incredibly brutal and would be designed to really induce the American compliance with all of the pre-existing practices.
Yes, but do those mechanisms, do they have to be agreed to by the whole of the European Union? And what happens if countries within it do not agree to applying those trade bazooka mechanisms?
Right. Exactly. If you have measures that are below the level of economic coercion, those can be undertaken by individual states if they feel they've been harmed, for sure. The power of the bazooka is that it is a unified, European-wide, coordinated action at that level, and that they can essentially agree among themselves that they will all take these measures. So you have to have at least the initial inquiry is triggered by the European Commission. You have any member state or the Commission itself can trigger an inquiry. It takes about maximum 4 months, and then at some point the Council has to take a decision. That's just a majority decision. It doesn't have to be unanimous, but a majority decision of the member states, and then they can decide that they will take this unified measure. But again, we're talking about issues where the individual member states and the Union agrees that this is an attack on the sovereignty of the states. And if indeed it rises to that level, and they've decided that indeed this is a sovereignty issue and they're being coerced, then it makes sense for all the states to band together, because of course they're going to be far stronger and they have a much more massive economy and far more leverage together. It's a sort of economic equivalent of NATO Article 5.
Understood. Now, clearly, Trump is combining the economic with, sanctions and tariffs and so on, with his political goals. Where do you think all this is heading, Professor?
Well, Trump is in many ways very difficult to understand his mentality. We can play the role of psychologist and try to extract from his very statements what he really wants. He had long discussed the U.S. withdrawing from NATO. He got a lot of legal pushback against that from Congress. And so potentially, if we just are speculating, this action in Greenland and these tariffs and these threats and everything could be a way for him to sort of figure out a political way to extract himself and the United States from Greenland. But again, we're really very much speculating on this. We could just take him for his word, which is that he thinks that the massive trade deficits, I think the U.S. has a trade deficit of some 200 billion something on the sort of euro with the European Union. He could be thinking that this is something that needs to be corrected, or that the U.S. needs to have increased manufacturing. It's really difficult often to figure out what he's really aiming at and what his ultimate goals are. I mean, if we just listen to his words, it seems to be that he thinks that he wants to achieve whatever will put the United States as the military, economic, and potentially even cultural leader in the world without peer. That seems to be, if we can extract anything from his statements, his ultimate goal. And he will use any means necessary, including tariffs.
Any means necessary, including tariffs. Professor Worcester, thank you very much for explaining that rather complex web of laws and circumstances. Do come and see us again soon. Have a good evening, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.